Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for sticking it out with us to the end. At this time, I would like to turn it over again to Alan Malik, who will wrap up the Academy with a presentation on data and markets.
Well, I'm back. I hope you all found the session this morning interesting and hopefully somewhat useful in terms of understanding the issues. Now I'm going to drill down into what I defined this morning as really the central factor in driving vacant, abandoned, distressed properties, which is how the real estate markets work to either foster them or eliminate them or reduce them. And I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you over the next little more than an hour. And fortunately, I'm sure the PowerPoint and hopefully the presentation will be available afterwards. So if you don't catch everything as I'm zipping through lots of stuff, you'll be able to go back and get it. And then again, you can always ask questions and I'll try to answer as many of them as I can. So next slide. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about basically 5 issues: how markets work as a general proposition, how they work specifically in terms of fostering vacant housing, the role of race and racism in markets, the role of public policy in markets, and finally, what kind of data you can use to understand what's going on in a market in your community. Next slide, please. So first, market fundamentals. Next. Okay, now I'm going to focus primarily today on neighborhood markets. Now, clearly, there is an overall regional housing market, and then within any region, there are likely to be somewhat different markets in different communities. So in the region that's shown on the left, this is the Trenton metro area. At one end, you have the city of Trenton that, for the most part, has a weak market. At the other end, the other, salmon-colored community on the map is Princeton, which has an exceptionally strong market. And a similar house might sell in Princeton for 10 times what it would sell for in Trenton. But if you look at the city of Trenton, and this is the important point, Trenton is full of literally dozens of separate submarkets at the neighborhood level. And each one is somewhat different. And if you're going to be working in a particular neighborhood or in a city, you really have to understand the neighborhood markets. Next slide, please. So what is a neighborhood market? This is one way. It is the sum of choices people make about investing their money and personal well-being in a neighborhood. It's simple. Maybe not quite so simple, but it's basically about people making choices. Now, there are lots of constraints and lots of biases built into people's choices, but it's still about people making choices. Next slide. So it's really about supply and demand. In any given neighborhood, you have a pool of houses and apartments. That represents, looking at it as a residential community, which is what I'm going to focus on, that represents the supply. Those houses can be large, small, old, new, in beautiful condition, in terrible condition, et cetera, et cetera. But that is the supply that the neighborhood provides. The demand is the sum of all of these people in the picture and more making decisions about where they should live, where they should buy a house, where they should rent, or where they should invest their money. And the relationship between the two is what defines a market. Next slide, please. Okay, now what goes into that are a lot of different factors, because one of the things, and there's a classic line in the real estate world saying, you're not buying a house, you're buying a neighborhood. So each neighborhood housing market is a function of a bunch of different factors. Some of them are endogenous, which means they're internal to the neighborhood. They're specific to the neighborhood. Others are exogenous, which means they come from outside the neighborhood, but they affect the neighborhood. Now, the exogenous factors are basically three. What is happening to the economy in the community and the region? Because people aren't concerned so much about the economy in a particular neighborhood, even in a particular city. If you live in Trenton, you can work all over the metro area. And if you live anywhere in the metro area, you can work in Trenton. The second is the migration patterns. Are people moving into the area or are they moving out? And who is moving in and who is moving out become really important. Are the people moving out the lower income people and the ones moving in the higher income people, or is it the other way around? And then the third one, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, is competition. Neighborhoods are always competing with other neighborhoods. And when you talk about what they're competing on, it's four factors. First, location. And location can be anything like, are you on a river? Are you next to a gorgeous park? Are you close to downtown? Do you have a transit station which will take people into New York City or whatever? Secondly, the housing supply. What kind of housing exists there? Is it available? Is it big, small, and so forth? Thirdly, amenities. Because again, people are looking to buy a neighborhood. And so people tend to, before they buy a house, walk around or drive around a neighborhood, see what's there. Being on a body of water, for whatever reason, is a very valuable amenity for an awful lot of people. So neighborhoods on rivers, on lakes, on the ocean, and so forth tend to have higher prices than other areas. Neighborhood stability is a little more complicated, but I think it's really important. It doesn't mean that nobody leaves, nobody comes in. It means, do people who are prospective home buyers feel that the neighborhood is a stable investment, that it's not going to collapse? And when I say investment, I mean in two ways, and they're both important. Obviously, if you're buying a home, and especially if you're a working class or middle class person who doesn't have a lot of money, this is probably the single biggest financial investment that you're going to make in your lifetime. But there's also a psychological or an emotional investment. When you buy a home, you are making a commitment to that neighborhood. Okay, not everybody is, but most people are. And most people plan to live there for an extended period of time. The average homeowner typically lives in the same house for anything from 12 to 15 or more years. And so they're making a commitment to that neighborhood, and they want to feel that the neighborhood is a safe, decent, non-deteriorating environment. And ideally, that it's on its way up. So all of these factors come together. And again, next slide, please. It's about individual choices. But here's the crux. One of the big problems, the big issues, is that choices are not rational or based on complete information. So if you think about, and I suspect probably many of the people in the audience at one point have become homeowners. Now, you have only so much information. You don't have complete information about every neighborhood and every house. So you're to a certain extent flying a little bit blind. Secondly, your income and other factors are going to limit your choices. Clearly, if you can afford to pay X for a house, and 80% of the neighborhoods houses cost more than X, that means you're limited to a very small number of neighborhoods if you want to become a home buyer. How choices are also affected by preferences. And I'll talk about this in a moment because preferences are a very important factor. But also, choices are affected by perceptions, which are in turn subject to a great deal of potential bias. So, for example, if somebody moves into a new area, you move to Trenton from, say, Topeka, Kansas, because you've taken a job at one of the research labs there. So you don't know the neighborhoods, you don't know the community, but you're going to be talking to your coworkers. And so you're going to pick up their prejudices. So, for example, and since Trenton, which is the main city in the region, is seen as a lower income city, it's also a majority minority city. It's a city with a lot of vacant properties and a lot of problems. So you're likely, if your coworkers are suburbanites, they're likely to say, oh, you don't want to buy in Trenton. Trenton's bad. Trenton's dangerous. Trenton's this or that. And so you're going to be affected by their biases. And of course, people have their own biases, which we'll get to in a little while. And then finally, the realtor you retain to help you in your search, the appraiser who looks at the properties, these are other people who are basically known as gatekeepers in this process, are going to influence your choices. So all in all, this is a very irrational process. And one of the things that a lot of neighborhoods do, in fact, work very hard on is when they are trying to build their market is how to get their message out there, how to market their neighborhood. And there's a whole series of skills and tricks to doing that effectively. And it's incredibly important because if you can't get the message out there, you can't tell people what's good about your neighborhood and what the opportunities are and why they should want to live there. They may have no other way of finding out. Next slide. The other thing is that people look for different kinds of things in their neighborhoods. If you're a family with kids, you're going to probably want, if you can, a separate house, perhaps with a yard. You want a neighborhood which children can play outdoors, hopefully where there's a good school in the area. If you're an empty nester, you might want a neighborhood that has amenities like transit, park, walkable restaurants, and things like that. So neighborhoods are segmented. And in fact, there's this organization called Claritas that comes up with these, they're kind of cutesy categories of people to segment the real estate market by. You've got your young and rustics, you've got your kid country USA people, you've got your American classics, and each of these groups is a group that's been identified as having a particular demographic, age, life cycle, and economic condition. So that's another factor that affects neighborhoods. Next slide. The other thing I mentioned is that neighborhoods are competing. The neighborhoods may not know they're competing, but they are, especially in a large region. There likely to be more than one neighborhood that fits the profile of what a particular family is looking for. So the question is, would you choose neighborhood A? If you could get here we have two houses, they're pretty much the same house. And let's say they cost within the same ballpark. And this is the kind of house that this young family in the lower left-hand corner is looking for. So do they pick the one in neighborhood A or the one in neighborhood B? And ultimately, if too many people pick the one in neighborhood A versus neighborhood B, then the odds are that neighborhood B is going to start showing signs of decline. Its prices may go down. Neighborhood B may become more desirable and its prices will go up. Next slide, please. So one last point about the market in general, and this is something that I realize not everybody agrees with this, but I think it's pretty solidly established. There is a fundamental, when you look at what makes for a strong market, it is fundamentally a strong market in a neighborhood which is basically about single family houses. And that's true of probably about 90% of all the neighborhoods in the United States. It's home ownership is a critically important part of market strength in that neighborhood. And because home buyers are making very fundamentally different decisions than either renters or investors. And again, as I mentioned, they're making a long-term commitment to their neighborhood that goes beyond the financial commitment. For an investor, looking at a house in a neighborhood is basically a question of, can I make enough money off this house to justify how much I have to pay for it and how much I might have to put into it in repairs? So in other words, it's a purely arm's length business transaction. The investor rarely has any more interest in that neighborhood than the return that he or she can get from that house. And again, if the investor feels the neighborhood is on the way down, the investor may concentrate on just trying to get as much cash flow out of the house and not worry about it. If the investor thinks the neighborhood is on its way up, the investor will try to hold the house and hopefully, after a certain number of years, sell it for a profit. But either way, the investor has no commitment to the neighborhood. And then finally, and believe me, there is a huge amount of research on comparing homeowners and renters. And most of it holds things like income level, race, family characteristics constant. So it's not looking at homeowners in general and renters in general, but looking at homeowners and renters of the same characteristics. And they find consistently that homeownership is more supportive of positive neighborhood features and more supportive of positive family features as well than renting. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that homeowners stay in the same house for a lot longer than renters. Renters typically don't stay in the same house or apartment for more than 2 to 3 years and sometimes less. As I mentioned, homeowners often stay 15, 20 years. But the fact is, that is a difference that's associated with the form of tenure. So I am not saying you should not have rental housing, and I'm not saying that all investors are bad people, which is not true. But I am saying that a healthy volume of home ownership is a good thing for a neighborhood. And if you're looking at a neighborhood and you're seeing the home ownership rate dropping significantly, that is a red flag that you should be concerned about. So continuing on, next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to talk specifically about vacant housing. And you'll see quite a few of the slides I'm going to show are basically the ones that I showed this morning. So I'm going to walk through them quickly. We talked about the relationship between supply and demand in terms of a strong versus a weak market. Next, please. And we talked about the 3 key factors that drive market weakness: so location disadvantages, physical deterioration, and obsolescence. On location, next slide. So for this just shows, this morning I showed a slide that compared 3 basically similar houses in different parts of the country. Here are 3 basically similar houses in the same city. And it gives you an idea of how much variation there is in market conditions by location, even in one relatively small city. Next, please. And again, I don't have to go back on this. Physical deterioration is a factor, and market obsolescence is a factor. So what happens when you get weak demand is you get a whole series of behaviors that start destabilizing the neighborhood. A couple of these I talked about this morning. The people are less likely to pay their mortgages. People are less likely to pay their property taxes. Buyers, investors are more likely to be speculators than long-term stable investors. And then people will not maintain and certainly not upgrade their properties. So the upshot is that what happens, and these are things, and we'll talk about tracking these through data later on, is as the market gets weaker, you will see more absentee-owned properties as properties flip from home ownership to investor ownership, more REO properties being held by banks, or for that matter, properties that become the property of the city or the county, or end up in a land bank. You'll see more properties that are deteriorating and need work, which becomes a big issue because one of the things that most home buyers look for when they go out to buy a house is a house that does not need major work. Now, we've all read about all these urban pioneers who go in, they buy a shell, and they spend the next 10 years of their lives fixing up this shell until it's a thing of beauty. Well, there are a few people who do that, but that is a tiny percentage of the market. And if you count on having those people as your buyers, you're going to wait around a long time. So you'll see more deteriorated properties, which means, again, they're not likely to sell. And then, of course, more abandoned properties. And this is where the vicious cycle I mentioned this morning comes in. Next slide, please. So as investment declines, tax and mortgage delinquency increases, properties deteriorate, they're abandoned. That further dampens demand and further creates still more mortgage and tax delinquency, deferred maintenance, deterioration, abandonment. So it goes around and around. And again, from the standpoint of somebody who's trying to revitalize a neighborhood that has a condition of weak demand, the big issue is, how do you break the cycle? That is the central question that you have to confront. And it's not easy. Next slide. So some of the signs, and I suspect I pretty much said this already. Obviously, if you have a weak demand area, you're going to have low sales prices. And in some cases, there'll be very, very low sales prices, especially for houses that need work. And while some people might think that that's a good thing, it really isn't. Because low sales prices don't mean low rents. And if you're somebody who is a credible would-be home buyer, then below some point, a lower price doesn't really help you particularly. So clearly prices that are too high are a problem, but prices that are too low can also be a problem because they discourage maintenance, they discourage investment, and they encourage short-term speculation and milking. You'll see low sales volumes in neighborhoods of weak demand, as fewer houses are being bought, and more of the buyers are investors rather than home buyers. And you'll see declining home ownership and increasing vacancy. Next slide. So some key points. Again, as I mentioned this morning, there are a lot of different reasons, a lot of different factors that go into where you have problem properties, vacant and abandoned properties. But, and I think this is a pretty good statement, you have to tackle the other problems. You have to tackle racism. You have to tackle bad public policies like tax foreclosure policies that send properties into kind of limbo. All of those things are important. But if you can't make the market stronger, you're just going to be working around the edges. You're very unlikely to be able to solve the central problems of that neighborhood. Okay. Now, that's a good segue. Next slide, please. Into the role of race in affecting markets, because this is very powerful and very important to understand. So next, okay. The first thing is racial discrimination. I mean, I'm not telling anybody anything all that new here. Racial discrimination goes way back. And in fact, just a little bit of history. Back in 1910, it was interesting. It was the city of Baltimore that invented the idea of racial zoning. People were very upset that a young Black lawyer and his family had moved into a row house in an otherwise white neighborhood. And so the city council passed a law which said no Black family was allowed to move into any neighborhood that was not already 50% Black. Now, they were an equal opportunity discriminator because the law also said that no white family would be allowed to move into a neighborhood that was over 50% Black. But that was hardly fair. Well, the idea of racial zoning caught on like crazy all over the country. And there were lots of cities adopted it. And predictably, eventually people brought lawsuits against it. And in 1917, the US Supreme Court ruled that racial zoning was illegal. Now, this was not because the US Supreme Court in 1917 was a anti-racist organization. That's certainly not the case. But they were concerned that this was an unreasonable infringement on people's property rights, their right to sell the property to whoever they wanted, and that the government should not mess with that. So then, and I don't know who came up with this. I don't know, the inventor of the racial covenant. Basically, what happened after that Supreme Court ruling, you started to get language written into deeds that said and this is one, I'll just read this one on the right-hand side because I don't know if you can read it. It's pretty small print. The party of the second part, which means the buyer, hereby agrees that the premises shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, Semitic, I think they mean Semitic, or African blood or descent. Now, that was challenged as well, but the Supreme Court upheld those in the 1928 or 26, I forget which, saying that this is okay because it's not the government imposing the restriction. It's the home buyer voluntarily agreeing to the restriction. So during the 20s and 30s, right up to 1948, when the Supreme Court reversed itself and said, hey, wait a minute, this is a bad thing. You can't do it. And right up till that point, a conservative guess would be that about 2/3 of all of the houses, single-family houses built in the United States for a period of almost 30 years, had covenants of this sort. They invariably excluded Black people. And like the one here, which is from Minneapolis, they very often excluded Jews, Asians, and other people as well. So that was a pattern until 1948. Next slide, please. Now, starting really during World War II, but especially after that, during the 40s and 50s, so forth, America's cities were transformed. The biggest four things. First, the second Great Migration meant that millions of Black families were moving into cities like Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, and so forth. At that point, when they started to move during the 40s, these cities were still hyper-segregated. So they were moving into areas that were known as ghettos. And appropriately so, because like the Jewish ghettos of the previous centuries in Europe, these were areas that were not just a question of people living there by choice. They were forced to live there by active patterns of segregation. By the late 40s, by the mid 40s, those areas were teeming. They were overcrowded. Housing conditions were terrible. They were also, in many ways, dynamic, viable communities in many cases. And they were very economically integrated because if you were Black, you pretty much had to live there, whether you were wealthy or poor or in the middle. But they were overcrowded and the housing conditions were terrible. Then two things happened. The big one was white flight. And millions of white families fled to the suburbs, where they moved into housing developments that were, for the most part, segregated themselves. So Black families were not given the option of moving to the suburbs. At the same time, the federal government had created the Urban Renewal Program to, quote, revitalize the cities, as well as the Interstate Highway Program. And these two programs were cutting great swaths of the cities into pieces, including disproportionately Black and Latinx neighborhoods. So something had to give. Next slide. What happened as the whites moved there were basically two groups of white families. There were lower income whites in lower income neighborhoods that were typically adjacent to the Black neighborhoods who moved to the suburbs. And there were middle class and affluent whites from neighborhoods that tended to be further out who moved to the suburbs. And what happened at that point is that the Black communities of America's cities bifurcated. Up to that point, they'd been very economically integrated. Now, generally speaking, low-income Black people moved into the adjacent, older, lower-income white immigrant neighborhoods. More affluent Black people moved into the further out middle-class neighborhoods and created, next slide, please, a whole cluster of, and this is something that people I don't think appreciate fully enough. The period from 1945 to 1980 was a period of extraordinary expansion in Black homeownership. The number of Black homeowners between 1960 and 1980, a much smaller period, doubled. And that was very much a function of middle class and working class Blacks with stable incomes moving into neighborhoods like the one in the picture here and basically stabilizing them after the white families had left. And these became what are known as the Black middle neighborhoods. And they're still an important part of America's cities to this day. Now, the problem, of course, is, next slide, is at the same time, areas of concentrated poverty also emerged. And that's where you saw the beginning of, in the 50s and 60s, you saw the beginning of the dynamic that has led to what our cities look like today, with areas that are deeply disinvested, that have 30, 40, 50% poverty, other areas that are now starting to struggle because, next slide, things have not gone well. And the biggest thing that happened was the subprime crisis. And this is where the neighborhoods where the subprime lenders really focused on were not the concentrated poverty neighborhoods. They were the Black middle neighborhoods, whether to offer existing homeowners, especially elderly homeowners, what are called cash out refinancings, or to offer mortgages to people to buy in those neighborhoods, but mortgages that were untenable. The Black middle neighborhoods in large numbers in many cities collapsed after the foreclosure crisis. And the picture on the left, on the right, well, it's an example. Here I'm showing what happened. Both white and this is where the racial nature of housing markets becomes so critical. Because white as well as black neighborhoods took a hit in the foreclosure crisis, but the white neighborhoods have recovered far more than the black neighborhoods. And if you look at the picture on the right, which is Detroit between 2000 and 2015, you'll see that the areas of concentrated poverty in Detroit grew enormously over that period. And during that same 15-year period, roughly 50% of all the middle-class black families who were living in Detroit in 2000 moved to the suburbs. Next slide. So the central issue is the racialization of housing markets. So if you look, the map is St. Louis. You can just, if you look at the areas that are predominantly black, and then you look at the number of white buyers, you'll see that basically white buyers, with very few exceptions, are not buying in predominantly black neighborhoods. And this, I probably shouldn't spend the time, but I love this study. A group of psychologists made up a series of pictures of neighborhoods, nice neighborhoods with people doing nice, normal things, washing their car, walking their dog, talking to their neighbors, and so forth, in nice houses, green lawns, the whole middle class shtick. One set of pictures had people with white faces. One set of pictures had people with black faces, otherwise identical. The neighborhoods, the pictures, and then people were asked how they ranked the neighborhoods. The neighborhoods with the people with black faces were consistently ranked lower. As they write, their prevailing mental image of black spaces is lower class. And this is an underlying issue that is a huge challenge in all our thinking. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll go on to the next slide now, which is how public policy affects markets. Next. Public policy is basically local government actions have a huge impact on neighborhood conditions, on problem properties, and on housing options. But it's very important to understand that local government actions are affected, in many cases, constrained by, especially by state laws and policies, to a lesser extent, federal laws. So anybody who wants to influence local government to do stuff differently in their city would be well advised to understand what are the state laws in your state that govern local government action. Because, as hopefully many of you know, local governments are, as somebody called them years ago, creatures of the state. They are totally subordinated to state government in terms of their powers. They have no inherent powers of their own except what state government will give them. So that's a critically important point. So next slide. So if we look at neighborhood conditions, and I won't go into any detail here, but you can get some idea. Everything from, does a street have shade trees? Is the street falling apart, or is it freshly paved? Are the sidewalks walkable, or are you likely to trip over something every few feet? Is garbage picked up regularly? Is there enough street lighting so that people can feel safe when they're walking? Are parks in good shape? Are codes enforced effectively? What does the zoning provide? Does it allow people to build the kind of houses that people want, or does it restrict their options? How safe is the city? How is the neighborhood? How effective in terms of establishing relationships with the community and creating safety is the local police department? And then again, how are the schools? Because even if families don't have a child in the schools, Schools are seen as a kind of a proxy for neighborhood stability. So it's tremendously important. So all of these things that the city does or doesn't do affect how a neighborhood is functioning and how successful it is. Next, please. And specifically, when it comes to vacant, abandoned, and distressed properties, powers, code enforcement. I talked about rental regulation a little bit this morning. That's a critical issue. Do they have a vacant property registration ordinance? Do they track vacant properties? Do they make sure they're securely boarded? If they have a tax foreclosure program, as pretty much everybody does the city take the properties? Can the properties go into land bank, or are they going into limbo? How well are vacant properties maintained? Who maintains them? Is it up to some investor on Wall Street, or is it the city or the county or a land bank? And then, as we talked about a little bit this morning, what kind of vacant lot programs do they have? So the basic takeaway here is that public policy, what government does, is incredibly important to neighborhoods, their stability, their quality of life, and their market strength. And number two, a lot of that is stuff that you don't automatically associate with housing markets, like shade trees, street lighting, garbage pickup, and so forth. And number three, look at what the state law permits or prohibits, as well as what the municipal programs are. So now the last section I'm going to talk about, next slide, please, is using data. So if you want to understand what is going on in your neighborhood from a market standpoint, there are a lot of data points that you can use, and they tell you a lot of different things. Now, the first thing, it's always useful to look at the big picture. What's happening regionally? Is the region growing or shrinking? Are people moving in? As I mentioned, who is moving in? Are they young families or empty nesters? Are they wealthy? Are they poor? And so forth. How much construction is going on? Is there a lot of construction? Is there an adequate supply of housing, or is there a shortage? Are there jobs? Are the jobs growing? All of these are critical issues. And this is important context. Now, the fact that a region may be growing doesn't tell you that a particular neighborhood is or is not growing. But the fact that a region is growing means that if you can start an effective strategy in that neighborhood to build the market and attract potential home buyers, there is a pool of potential home buyers that is moving into the area that you might be able to tap. If the region is actually losing people, if more people are leaving than coming in, then you're going to have a much harder time of it to develop an effective strategy to build the market in your neighborhood. So it's important to have the big picture. But from that point, then you really want to zoom in on the neighborhood data itself. Okay, so next slide. Now, as I mentioned, in a large city, like this is Baltimore, you've got every different kind of market. If you go around the city, you can have neighborhoods where houses sell for a great deal of money and they're very much in demand, to middle income neighborhoods where sort of working class people may be able to find a house that they can afford, to neighborhoods that have concentrated poverty, are losing population, and have vast numbers of vacant and abandoned houses. Now, in a lot of smaller cities, the range is much narrower. So, for example, now Trenton, which is a city of 90,000 people compared to Baltimore's 600,000, has a lot of variation between neighborhoods, but the extremes are closer. The strongest neighborhood is less strong than the strongest neighborhood in Baltimore by far. Next slide. So when what we do to look at neighborhood markets is we look at a series of variables which can be measured, which give a picture of the market. And there are basically two types of measures. One are indicators that directly measure the activity taking place in the real estate market. And the second are indicators that measure factors that influence the market. They're not market as such, but they influence the market in significant ways. So next slide. So the first set are measures of market activity. And basically, here are the three biggies. I mean, you can look at other factors, but these are the three major ones. What prices are houses selling for? How many houses are selling? And who is buying? Are they home buyers or investors? And the best way to track this data is by actually tracking recorded sales transactions. Now, every county of any significance in the United States or city records, when you buy a house, that transaction is recorded by some official body, and that data is public record. Now, in some communities, the data is made available on the web. In New Jersey, the state makes the data available for the entire state, including the community, the block, the lot, the address, the buyer, the seller, et cetera, online, free and easily downloaded as an Excel spreadsheet. Most states don't do that. So that data is the most valuable because one thing is, if you have ever been tempted to look at the census data for median sales value of single family houses, don't believe it. There's a technical term that is used in statistics to refer to that data, which is it's bullshit. Because basically, the way they get that data is they ask the owners what they think their house is worth. And that is inherently unreliable. So don't use census data for purposes of tracking the real estate market. But if you don't have access to recorded sales transactions, there are a variety of other services you could use. If you know a realtor who will share the multiple listing service data with you, that's pretty good. But multiple listing service data, which means properties that are bought and sold through realtors, tends to have an upward bias, meaning it's data that tends to be more skewed towards the more expensive houses, because a lot of very low value houses go through informal transactions that don't involve realtors. You can also buy data from recorded sales transactions from companies like Atom and CoreLogic. And depending on your budget, the prices are not outrageous, so it's possible. Tracking sales to home buyers and investors is a little more difficult because, generally speaking, the sales records don't actually say so-and-so is an investor, so-and-so is a home buyer. But there is a way to do it. And next slide. What you do is you look at, this is a little screen grab from the spreadsheet of real estate transactions in Trenton, New Jersey. And so what you do is you match addresses. So if the address is the same for the buyer and the seller, that's likely to be a homeowner. For the buyer's property address and the address of the property, the address of the property and the address that the buyer has put down for purposes of where the property tax bill should go. If it's the same, then odds are that's a homeowner. But some investors use that as well. So then you have to look at the name of the investor. And here you see this property, it's called 68 West End LLC. That is likely to be an investor, not a homeowner. So by doing this kind of matching process, which actually somebody who really understands how to do this stuff, not me, but can do pretty quickly, you can get a very reliable estimate of the mix between investors and home buyers buying in a neighborhood. Next slide. The factors that affect the market are, as I discussed earlier, tax delinquency and tax foreclosure, vacant properties, crime, violent crime in particular, and the homeownership rate. Now, tax delinquency, depending on whether the city or the county has the responsibility for dealing with property tax delinquencies, those are, again, official public records, which you should be able to get. City or county police departments typically have crime records that are down to the specific location of the crime that can then be coded to neighborhoods or census tracts. Now, some cities are more open about sharing their data than other cities, but the data is there. And then vacant properties, what a lot of communities have done lately, and it is well worth it, it takes less time and effort than you might think, are actually getting out and doing a parcel survey and recruiting people, giving them a day of training, and walking or driving down the streets, classifying whether properties are vacant, and also in the process, identifying properties that are seriously substandard, even though they may be occupied. So, next slide. And one thing is you can take this data, and by combining these different indicators in different ways, you can create a profile, a market profile of the neighborhood. And here are two examples, one which was done for Trenton, one which is done for Baltimore. And this gives you a very good sense, and especially if you do this every few years, you can get a sense of which neighborhoods are trending up, which neighborhoods are trending down. You can look at individual indicators and see where vacant properties are increasing or where tax delinquencies are decreasing. So this is an immensely powerful tool for being able to look at your neighborhood. Next slide. And I'm trying to run through this because I'd like to really have a chance to answer some questions before it's too late. And the other thing just to look at is sometimes the markets are different even within the same neighborhood. Even a few blocks over here may be very different from the next set of blocks just across some major street. And this is an example from Flint, how, again, one neighborhood is basically, from a market standpoint, totally dead in the water. You cross the street, and the area across the street is actually not only the houses are much more valuable, but the houses are appreciating much faster than on the other side of the street. Again, there are all kinds of reasons. If you drill down, you'll undoubtedly find reasons for this. But it's important to know that markets can be incredibly fine-grained and specific. So, next slide. So there are a lot of ways you can use this data. You can understand what's going on, understand the trends, get market trajectories, then look at individual variables and see where they're going up or down and so forth. Track the change over time, and ideally create a data warehouse that people in the community, people in the city can all use to understand their neighborhoods. And one last thing is this is all about quantitative data, but don't underestimate what people know about what's going on in their neighborhoods, especially people who may be in positions where they tend to talk to a lot of people, or observe a lot of things. Like, interestingly, one person who may know an awful lot about what's happening in the neighborhood is the man or woman who delivers the mail. Local realtors know a lot. A storekeeper who sees people come in and go and talks to them may know a great deal. So the person who runs the barber shop and cuts people's hair. So there are a lot of people who know stuff, and very often, because there's usually a lag in getting quantitative data, these people may sometimes be aware of trends that are starting to emerge before it shows up in the data. So one thing you may want to do, if you're serious about really trying to understand and track neighborhood markets, maybe identify 10, 12 people who just have their sense of what's going on in their neighborhood. And maybe every 3 or 4 months, invite them to lunch, feed them nicely, and then ask them questions about what they're seeing. So that can really add reality to the numbers. Next slide. So all I'd like to say about this, and because there's not much time and I do want to be able to answer a few questions, is it is really important to base your strategy on data. You don't, and you have to be very careful. We're all subject to biases, to wishful thinking, to being influenced by the last person we talked to, being struck by one thing or another, and so forth. And we simply are not objective people. We can use the data to get a handle on what's really going on and use that to inform our strategy. And then say, if the data says X, Y, and Z, then say, and my goal is to move the market. What is X, Y, and Z telling me about what strategies are likely to work, what strategies are not likely to work, and what things I've got to combine in order to create an effective strategy? So ultimately, data, believe it or not, is your friend. So with that, let me take a few questions. Okay, now this is an interesting one. And there are quite a few regions in this country where the entire region is not growing. Now, in some Rust Belt areas, the region may be growing even though the central city is shrinking. But in some areas, the most distressed areas in particular, and including a lot of rural areas and small towns, the entire region is losing population. So what do you do? At that point, the danger of building neighborhood market strategies is that you're basically in a zero-sum game. In those situations, anytime neighborhood A becomes a little better attracting people, you're taking them away from neighborhood B. Because if there's no growth, somebody is going to get hurt. So the first thing, and this is a subject that's worth spending hours on, we have to start getting away from the idea that growth is what it's all about. The United States population is still growing, but it's slowing down. Next 10, 20 years, in all likelihood, the entire United States is going to go into zero population growth. We've got to stop thinking that growth is going to solve our problems. And we have to start asking some very different questions, like, how do we improve the quality of life in a neighborhood without growth? And this is getting away from market. At that point, we have to maybe step back from market thinking. And we have to start thinking about quality of life for people. Can you have good schools without growth? I don't see why not. Can you have a safe community without growth? I don't see why not. People may not have a lot of money, but that does not mean that there can't be a decent quality of life. So I think the key issue is how to rethink how a city or a town works when growth starts to end. And I don't think it's end of life care. I mean, back in ancient times, if a city lost its economy, everybody would pick up and move. That's not happening nowadays. A lot of people stay. A lot of them are dependent on SNAP and Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security and vouchers and everything else, but they're not just picking up and moving. So cities like Youngstown, Gary, cities that are in really desperate economic shape are not going away. So we have to be thinking about how we can make those decent places to live without growth. And that is tough. Okay. Okay, one thing, this is something that I think is important because I am not talking about gentrification. I mean, yes, there is such a thing as gentrification, but when we look at most of the cities where you have vacant and abandoned properties, gentrification is a relatively small phenomenon. If you looked at Detroit, for example, the number of neighborhoods which you can say seriously, these neighborhoods are gentrifying, is relatively few. It's very few. And there are far more neighborhoods that are either losing ground or are basically flat on their backs. And here's something that I think is really important to bear in mind. A lot of people believe that gentrification, gentrifiers, people who are trying to gentrify neighborhoods, target Black neighborhoods. The truth is actually the opposite. And it reflects, again, the racialization of housing markets in this country. If you look at almost any city, now there's some, obviously, I am not saying that no Black neighborhoods have been gentrified. Yes, they have. But in cities where the path of gentrification, if you will, has a choice basically of going to like working class or lower income white or Latinx neighborhoods versus similar Black neighborhoods, it will consistently go to the white or Latinx neighborhoods. And there is a vast amount of research to support that proposition. So what I'm talking about is how you take neighborhoods and make them decent, stable neighborhoods, not for wealthy people, but for working class and middle class families. And hopefully neighborhoods which still have room for low income families and low income renters and homeowners. So I thought this was an interesting question because I haven't a clue to what the answer is likely to be. How do community land trusts compare with homeownership in terms of their impact on people's involvement in their neighborhoods? Unfortunately, community land trusts, there aren't enough of them with enough houses in most cases to really be able to study it. It would be very nice. I don't know if anybody has ever studied this question, at least in some of the communities like Burlington, Vermont, where you have a community land trust with a large number of houses. But the evidence is now in terms of rentals, subsidized rental housing, the people who live in subsidized rental housing, especially if it's high quality subsidized rental housing, tend to stay there longer than people who live in the run-of-the-mill private market housing, but not that much longer. Nowhere's, if the difference is like maybe between an average of 2 years or so versus an average of 4 or 5 years compared to the 15 years or so for homeowners. So in that respect, I don't think that doesn't seem to have a huge impact. The other, if you're a homeowner living in a house that is part of a community land trust, I suspect you probably think you're a homeowner, feel like a homeowner, act like a homeowner, and after all, you are a homeowner. So I suspect that you're probably likely to be as engaged. Now, obviously, community land trusts vary very widely. Some of them work really hard to engage and keep the people who are part of the land trust actively engaged in their communities. Others do less so. So I think it's a mixed bag, but it would be a very interesting question to ask. Now, here's an interesting question that I'd like to flag. The answer, most of these questions, the answer seems to always be yes and no. This is where you get a problem. Back in the 70s, there was quite a wave of urban homesteading where people were offering dollar homes to people and who would then fix them up. And most of the people who participated in those programs were middle class or fairly affluent people who had a lot of discretionary income, who had some savings, or maybe their parents had savings that were willing to give or lend them, and they wanted to rehab that house. And generally speaking, they did not have kids. Now, that worked in some neighborhoods where the houses were particularly appealing architecturally, historically, or the neighborhood was exceptionally well located. Like there are a couple of neighborhoods down near the Inner Harbor in Baltimore that they did that. But when you do it for lower income people who would like to be home buyers, you're often not doing them a favor, because they typically don't have a lot of flexible capital of their own that they can invest in the house. It's very difficult to borrow money to rehab a house, especially if you don't have great credit or great assets to begin with. If the house cannot be lived in from day one, then you have to pay the cost of wherever you're living at the moment while you're trying to raise the money to fix up this house. So I think this is a program that is basically a niche program for affluent families. It is not a good strategy for low-income families who are struggling to make ends meet. On top of which, anybody who gets a shell or a house in need of major rehab basically has to be the GC for that house. Some people have the skills. Some people are incredibly handy and can just go into a house and start doing wiring and plumbing and so forth without even batting an eyelash. Most normal people aren't like that. It's tough work. So I think this is a program that you have to be very careful about. Let's see. Let's see what this. The problem is anti-renter bias is bad. Anti-homeownership bias is equally bad. Any solid housing market needs both of them. But what I tried to say is the nature of homeownership versus rental adds something that is valuable for the neighborhood. That said, you need a decent percentage, a solid percentage of rental housing, and you want that housing to be well maintained and cared for. So finding the balance is very, very difficult. And I think you have to walk the tightrope. You don't want to be anti-homeownership. You don't want to be anti-renter. You want to say both are needed to house the American people. In this country, in round numbers, roughly 2/3 of all families are homeowners and about 1/3 are renters. Now, if you look at the rest of the world, that's pretty much in the middle of the pack. So that's not a bad ratio. Now, there are probably a fair number of renters who might want to be homeowners. And if they can, then that's a good idea. And there are probably a fair number of homeowners who at some point in their life are going to become renters again. So the fact is, we've got to do both and think about this in a balanced way. And saying that homeownership is a bad idea or rental is a bad idea, that's a bad idea to say either of those things. I think I am just about out of time. So I will say again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to all of you. I wish I had a chance to meet you, except as names in a long scroll in the chat box. And I hope I will at some future time. But again, thank you and have a good rest of your day. Christina?
Great. Another excellent presentation, Alan. Thank you so much. And especially thank you to all of our presenters today and to all of you for joining us for the 2022 VAT Academy. We hope you found today's presentations informative and that you leave the event feeling equipped and empowered to lead change in your community. Please be on the lookout in the chat for a survey and let us know about your experience today. And a final reminder that presentations will be emailed within the next couple of weeks. And a quick correction to a tidbit that I said earlier about replays. Those will be available within 24 hours within the Hopin platform, but we'll also post them to our YouTube page. And we'll be sure to make sure that everyone that attended to today's events will get a copy of that. So with that, thanks so much for joining us, and we hope you have a great afternoon. Bye, everyone.